Steve Harvey had been hosting Family Feud for nearly 2 decades, and he thought he had developed the emotional capacity to handle virtually any situation that arose on stage. He had witnessed confessions that shocked audiences, heard testimonies of sacrifice that moved millions to tears, and listened to stories that had challenged everything he thought he knew about identity, family, and the secrets people carry. But on that humid August afternoon in 2027, a 42-year-old woman named Diana Foster would share a secret so explosive, so completely life-altering in its implications for everyone standing on that stage, that Steve would literally freeze, his entire body going rigid, his face locked in an expression of absolute disbelief, standing motionless for nearly 20 seconds while his mind tried to process what he'd just heard. Because the secret Diana was revealing would fundamentally change the identities and understanding of reality for multiple people, and there was no going back once the words were spoken. 2 families stood ready to compete, the Mitchell family from California and the Foster family from Pennsylvania. The Foster family drew immediate attention because of the palpable tension emanating from them, particularly centered around Diana Foster, an attractive 42-year-old woman with auburn hair, green eyes, and a rigid posture that suggested someone preparing to detonate a bomb she'd been carrying for decades. She wore a simple navy dress, and her hands trembled constantly. Standing beside her were her husband Robert, who was in his mid-40s and looked deeply anxious, her teenage son Lucas, who was 17, and her daughter Emma, who was 15. But there was something else. Standing slightly apart from the family group was a woman in her late 60s named Patricia, who was introduced as Diana's mother, and a man in his early 40s named James, who was introduced only as family. During the pre-interview, Diana had been composed but visibly fighting to maintain control. When asked about her family, she had said something that seemed straightforward but carried ominous undertones. "My family is here today because I need to tell them something I should have told them years ago, decades ago in some cases, a secret about who I am, about who they are, about relationships and identities that have been built on a foundation that isn't what everyone thinks it is. Once I tell this secret, everything changes for everyone standing with me. There's no undoing it. But I can't carry it anymore, and they deserve to know the truth before more time passes." Diana's husband Robert, when asked what Diana might reveal, had spoken with obvious distress. "Diana told me 4 days ago that she's kept a major secret from me, from our children, from her family, for over 20 years. She wouldn't tell me what the secret is. She said she needs to tell everyone at once, publicly, because if she tells people individually she'll lose her courage. She said once she reveals this secret, our family will never be the same, our children's understanding of who they are will change, and relationships will have to be completely reimagined. I'm terrified. I don't know if our marriage will survive whatever she's about to say." The Foster family won their game with tense efficiency, Diana contributing answers in a tight voice. As they lined up for fast money, Diana stepped to the podium immediately, and Steve began with his characteristic energy. "Right, Diana, let's bring this home for your family." 25 seconds, here we go. Name something, people. But Diana held up both hands and said with sudden urgency, "Mr. Harvey, stop, please stop. I can't play this game. I can't stand here for one more second without telling my family the truth, the secret I've been carrying for 23 years. Please, I need to tell them right now before I lose my nerve completely." Steve stopped immediately, his face shifting to serious concern, and he said, "Diana, what's going on?" The studio fell into an expectant silence. Diana turned to face her family, her husband Robert, her children Lucas and Emma, her mother Patricia, and the man named James. And tears were already streaming down her face as she said, "I need to tell you all something that's going to change everything you think you know about our family, about who you are, about relationships that you've understood one way your entire lives but that are actually completely different." She looked at her son Lucas and said, "Lucas, you're 17 years old. You've grown up knowing Robert as your father. You've called him Dad your entire life. And Robert has been your father in every way that matters. He's raised you, loved you, been there for you. But Robert is not your biological father, and I need to tell you who is." The studio gasped, and Robert's face showed he was hearing this for the first time despite Diana's claim that she'd told him there was a secret. Lucas's face went white, and he said, "Mom, what are you talking about?" Diana took a shaking breath and turned to look at James, the man who had been standing slightly apart from the family group. She said, "James is your biological father, Lucas. James and I were together before I met Robert. I got pregnant with you when I was 25, and James was your father. But James and I broke up before you were born, and I met Robert shortly after, and Robert thought you were his son. I let him believe that. For 17 years, I've let Robert believe Lucas was his biological child when he wasn't." Steve's mouth fell open in shock, and Robert looked like he'd been physically struck. But before anyone could respond, Diana continued, and what she said next made the first revelation seem minor by comparison. She looked at James and said, "But that's not the biggest secret. That's not the secret that changes everything." She turned to her daughter Emma and said in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "Emma, sweetheart, I need to tell you something about who you are, about who your father is, and about a relationship that you've never known about." Emma's face showed confusion and growing fear, and she said, "Mom, what are you talking about? Dad is my father, right?" Diana shook her head, tears pouring down her face, and said, "No, Emma, Robert is not your biological father either. Neither is James. Your biological father is someone else entirely, someone who's standing right here with us." She turned to look at her mother Patricia, and then she said the words that would change everything. "Emma, your biological father is Patricia's husband, my stepfather, the man you know as your grandfather. Patricia, your husband Michael got me pregnant when I was 18 years old, before I ever met James or Robert. Michael is Emma's father. My stepfather is my daughter's father. Emma's grandfather is actually her father." The studio erupted in cries of shock and horror, and Steve literally froze. His entire body went rigid, his face locked in an expression of absolute disbelief, and he stood completely motionless, unable to move or speak or process what he had just heard. Patricia, Diana's mother, made a sound like she'd been stabbed, and she collapsed into a chair, her face showing complete devastation. Emma was crying and shaking her head in disbelief. Robert looked like he was in shock, unable to process that neither of the children he'd raised were biologically his. Diana continued sobbing, "When I was 18 years old, my stepfather Michael, who had married my mother when I was 16, he sexually assaulted me, multiple times over the course of several months. I was too scared and too ashamed to tell anyone, and I got pregnant with Emma. I ran away from home, I cut off contact with my mother and Michael, and I told everyone that Emma's father was a boyfriend I'd had who had left. I never told anyone the truth, that Emma was the result of my stepfather raping me when I was 18 years old." Patricia was sobbing uncontrollably, saying, "No, no, no," over and over. Emma looked like she was going to be sick. Diana said, "Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have told you decades ago what Michael did to me. But I was 18, I was terrified, I was ashamed, and I ran away instead of telling you. And then years passed, and it became impossible to tell you. You stayed married to Michael, you built a life with him, and I couldn't bring myself to destroy that by revealing what he'd done, so I kept the secret for 24 years. And Emma has grown up thinking Michael was her grandfather when he's actually her father, the man who raped her mother." Steve finally unfroze, and he raised both hands and said in a voice that was shaking badly, "Stop. We need to stop everything right now. Cut the cameras. Stop all production. We need mental health professionals here immediately." The cameras cut, and for over 2 hours the studio was in crisis. Mental health professionals came to work with the family. Patricia was in shock, learning that her husband had raped her daughter and that her granddaughter was actually the product of that rape. Emma was being counseled through learning that her grandfather was her father and that she was the product of sexual assault. Robert was trying to process that neither of the children he'd raised were biologically his. Lucas was learning his father wasn't who he thought. And Diana was finally, after 24 years, speaking the truth about what had been done to her. When filming eventually resumed hours later, it was not to continue Family Feud but to have Steve address what had just happened with appropriate gravity. He sat with Diana and said, "Diana, You just revealed that when you were 18, you were sexually assaulted by your stepfather, that your daughter Emma is the result of that assault, and that you've kept this secret for 24 years. You also revealed that your son Lucas's biological father is James, not Robert, who raised him. These revelations have fundamentally changed the identities and relationships of everyone in your family. Why are you telling them now? Why after so many years? Deanna, exhausted and drained, said, "Because I couldn't carry it anymore, Mr. Harvey. For 24 years, I've lived with the knowledge that my daughter Emma is the product of rape, that my stepfather, a man she's called Grandpa her entire life, is actually her father and my rapist. I've watched Emma hug him, spend time with him, love him as her grandfather, and I've said nothing because I was protecting my mother and protecting myself from having to relive the trauma. But Emma is 15 now, and she deserves to know the truth about where she comes from, and my mother deserves to know what her husband did to me, and I deserve to finally name what happened to me as rape instead of continuing to hide it." She looked at her mother, Patricia, and said, "Mom, I'm sorry I didn't tell you 24 years ago what Michael did to me. I was 18, I was scared, and I ran away instead of fighting. And then you married him, and time passed, and it became impossible to tell you without destroying your life. But Michael is a rapist, Mom. He raped your daughter when she was 18 years old, multiple times, and Emma is the result. You've been married to a man who sexually assaulted your child, and you had a right to know that." Patricia, who had been silent in shock, finally spoke. She said through tears, "Are you telling me that Michael, my husband of 26 years, raped you when you were 18, and Emma is the product of that rape?" "Diana, why didn't you tell me?" Diana said, "Because I was 18 and terrified and ashamed, and because by the time I had the courage to tell you, you'd been married to him for years, and I couldn't bring myself to destroy your life. But I should have told you, Mom. You had a right to know what kind of man you married." Emma, who had been crying silently, finally spoke. She said in a small, broken voice, "So Grandpa Michael, the man I've known my whole life, he's not my grandfather. He's my father. And he's a rapist who assaulted my mom when she was 18. That means I'm the product of rape. That's what I am. That's where I come from." Diana moved to her daughter and held her, saying, "No, baby, you're not the product of rape. You're my daughter, and I love you. What happened to me doesn't define you. Michael may be your biological father, but that's just biology. You're not what he did to me. You're your own person and you're loved." The episode that eventually aired, months later, after extensive legal proceedings, therapeutic intervention, and with the family's consent, became one of the most controversial programs in television history. Diana's revelations sparked intense discussions about sexual assault within families, about the long-term impacts of keeping secrets about rape and parentage, about the trauma of learning your origins are violent, and about the ethics of revealing such devastating truths publicly. Most significantly, Diana's revelation led to a criminal investigation. Michael, Diana's stepfather and Emma's biological father, was arrested and charged with historical sexual assault. He initially denied the allegations, but Diana's detailed account, combined with DNA testing that confirmed Michael was Emma's father, led to his conviction. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison at age 67 for the rape of his 18-year-old stepdaughter 24 years earlier. Patricia divorced Michael immediately upon learning what he had done, saying in a statement, "I was married for 26 years to a man who raped my daughter when she was 18 years old. I had no idea. He hid his crime for decades, and my daughter hid it from me to protect me, and as a result I stayed married to a rapist. I am devastated, I am heartbroken, and I am grateful Diana finally found the courage to tell the truth even though it came far too late." Robert struggled with the revelation that neither Lucas nor Emma were his biological children, but ultimately chose to remain in the family, saying, "Biology doesn't make you a father. Raising children makes you a father. I've been Lucas and Emma's dad for 17 and 15 years respectively, and that doesn't change just because I'm not their biological father. What changes is that now we all know the truth, and we can deal with that truth honestly instead of living in deception." Emma underwent extensive therapy to process learning that she was the product of rape, and that her grandfather was actually her father and a rapist. She said in later interviews, "Learning that I was conceived through rape was devastating. Learning that the man I'd called grandpa my whole life was actually my father and had raped my mom when she was barely older than I am now. That destroyed my sense of reality. But my mom helped me understand that I'm not what he did to her, I'm my own person. What he did doesn't define me, and knowing the truth, however painful, is better than living in a lie." The story of Diana Foster's secret became a powerful and controversial testimony about the long-term impacts of childhood sexual assault, about the impossible choices survivors make about when and whether to reveal what happened to them, about the cascading effects of family secrets, about parentage and rape, and about the trauma that comes from learning that your identity and family relationships are fundamentally different from what you believed. But perhaps most significantly, Diana's revelation became a reminder that sexual assault within families often remains hidden for years or decades because survivors are protecting themselves and others at enormous personal cost. That children conceived through rape deserve to know their origins, even though that truth is painful, and that secrets about parentage and assault eventually cause more harm than the truth would have caused if spoken earlier. As Diana said in a final interview, "For 24 years, I kept the secret that my stepfather raped me when I was 18 and that my daughter Emma was the product of that rape. I kept quiet to protect my mother, to protect myself from having to relive the trauma, and to protect Emma from knowing she was conceived through violence. But that silence meant my mother stayed married to a rapist. Emma grew up believing her rapist grandfather was a safe family member, and I carried unbearable shame and trauma alone. Revealing the truth was devastating for everyone, but it was also necessary. My mother deserved to know what her husband did. Emma deserved to know her true origins, and I deserved to finally name what happened to me as rape instead of continuing to hide it. The truth came far too late, and I regret that. But late truth is still better than continued lies, even when the truth is this painful."